This is Algebra 2, Lesson 10.1, and today you're going to be using graphing calculators to sketch graphs of polynomials. In the last few years, you've learned how to sketch graphs of lines, of parabolas, circles, but you haven't learned how to graph polynomials that are not necessarily parabolas. So that's why we're using the graphing calculator. So I'm going to give you a sample equation. We're going to call it P of x. And the equation is x plus 1 times x minus 2 times x minus 5 squared. Today you'll also be given the window settings for the graphing calculator so that you can make sure you see all of the parts of the graphs that are important. The minimum x should be -10. The maximum x should be +10. The scale for x will be 1. And then for the y's, the minimum should be -50. The maximum should be +50. And the scale will make that a scale of 10. So on the graphing calculator, the first thing we want to do is go to the y equals screen so that we can type in the equation. So in the y equals screen, so if there's already something there, go ahead and clear it. We're going to type this in exactly how it appears with all the parentheses. So parentheses x, which is here, plus 1, close parentheses, parentheses x minus 2, close parentheses, parentheses x minus 5, close parentheses, squared is this button right here. And then before you graph it, make sure you go to the window and set these as the window settings. So a window, -10 for the minimum x, +10 for maximum x, scaled by 1, -50 for the y minimum, +50 for y maximum, and scale of 10 for the y. As soon as your window settings match these window settings here, then hit graph to see what it looks like. And on your paper today, we're going to look closely at the x values, but don't worry too much about the y values. So we're going to look at the x-intercepts specifically and plot them on the paper. So we can see that this graph intersects the x-axis at -1, +2, and +5. So those are the only points I'm going to plot. So sketch those 3 x-intercepts on your paper, and everything else is just a sketch. So we're going to sketch the graph we see by looking at the x-intercepts and then the rest of the behavior of the graph. And don't worry too much about how low or how high the graph goes. After you sketch the graph, there are a few things we need to describe. The first part of the description is the x-intercepts. So we're going to say going through, and the points we're going to describe as going through are the x-intercepts where the graph starts on one side of the axis and then goes through to the other side. So -1 is one point where the graph goes through. And then the graph starts here and then goes through +1. But then when we get to +5, the graph hits +5 but doesn't go through to the other side of the x-axis. This is called a bounce. So the graph hits 5 and then bounces back up. So we say the graph bounces at 5. And then the second thing we're going to describe is how the graph starts on the right side and how the graph ends on the left side. So the graph starts On the right side, the graph is above the x-axis, so we say it starts positive. And the left side of the graph we're going to call the end of the graph. The graph also ends above the x-axis, so we say that the graph ends positive as well. So for each graph today, you're going to sketch it, describe where the x-intercepts are. This one went through these 2 points and had a bounce at 5. And then you're just going to describe whether the graph starts and ends positive or negative.